When did the Word become flesh? Well, the moment Yahweh speaks something, it happens. That's for sure. So the moment of conception is the moment that the Word of the Father became flesh. The Word became flesh is here a straightforward reference to Christ's nature, not merely his birth. 1 John chapter 4 and verse 2. God manifested himself in the flesh of humanity. 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 16. Not in stone. Exodus chapter 34 and verse 6. Jesus was of David's seed. Romans chapter 1 and verse 3. Under a curse. Galatians chapter 3 and verse 13. Being born of a woman under the law. Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4. And made sin. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 21. He was of sinful flesh. Romans chapter 8 and verse 3. In the likeness of men, in the form of a slave. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 7. And like his brethren. Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 17. Thus at the conception and birth of Jesus the Word became flesh, which is the body prepared of God. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 5. Prepared for what? For the indwelling of the Spirit. John chapter 3 and verse 34. For the one whom God sent speaks the sayings of God, for he does not give the Spirit by measure. The Word also became flesh when Jesus began to teach. He said, his words or logos was not his, but God's. John chapter 14 and verse 24. He that loves me not, keepeth not my words, logos, and the word, logos, which ye hear, is not mine, but the Father's who sent me. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 7. Beloved, no new commandment write I unto you, but an old commandment that ye had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word, logos, which ye heard. So the word, or logos, also became flesh at the baptism of Jesus. John chapter 1 and verse 15. Concerning him, John gave this testimony. This is the one about whom I said, though he is coming behind me, he preceded me, and he came before me. John chapter 1 and verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us, and we beheld his glory, glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. So John chapter 1 and verse 14 is referring to the time when the human Jesus came to dwell amongst his disciples after John the Baptizer announced his coming in verse 15. These things happened in the beginning of the public ministry of the Word. The and in John chapter 1 and verse 14 connects the clause that says the Word became flesh with the clause that says dwelt amongst us. There is no reason to insert a 30-year gap between these two clauses. This is also confirmed by the writer in John, in the first letter of John, chapter 1 and verse 1, where he says that the word or logos of life is what the disciples heard and saw with their eyes and handled with their hands. The disciples did not have this fellowship, 1 John chapter 1 and verse 3, with Jesus Christ, or hear the message he proclaimed, 1 John chapter 1 and verse 5, until the time when he went in and out among them, beginning with the baptism of John, Acts chapter 1, verses 21 to 22.